All right, here I am in OculusWorldDemo. The one hotkey takes me right up to the balcony, and it's a good place to demonstrate lots of these things from. So I'm going to go through these. Scene content. I can bring in the cubes. Next, animated blocks. Animated blocks are cool. Next, the grid. If I turn on 0 IPD, I lose stereoscopy, maximum FOV. What this does, it's making the blinders bigger. If I decrease pixel density to, say, 0.5, I'm getting about over 1,000 frames a second because I have, again, decreased my render target resolution. But everything looks a little bit more pixely and blurry now. Turn this from black to blue. All right, that's all the render target settings. Sensor toggle. You can't toggle this in the menu, but you can use the hotkey. This just turns off head tracking. And now that my sensor toggle is off, I can no longer look around the scene, and my positional tracking is also deactivated. And you can actually play the demo like this, but you can only do it by using your mouse and keyboard. And you can no longer do it by you can no longer look around using your head. If you want this to feel natural, you have to keep your head perfectly still. Otherwise, the moment you move it even a little bit, you will feel disoriented. You will immediately notice that. So you can only play a Rift demo with head tracking disabled if you keep your head perfectly still. Which is why normally you would not want to do that. So I'm going to hit F6. When I hit F6, first my rotational head tracking comes back, then it jerks again, and that means that my positional tracking has come back because my camera turned back on. Next, time warping. So time warp is enabled by default. Time warping JIT is, I believe, either an optimization or a way that they do time warping. I think JIT time warping means that they do it right before the frame is rendered, and if you turn no JIT on, then it probably does time warping at an earlier time, probably right after the frame is rendered, and then it lets that frame sit around for the rest of the frame. So practically speaking, when you enable this, the effect that you see is now if I turn my head left and right, actually I have to turn Vsync. If I leave Vsync off, I won't actually notice any difference because my frames are so short. It doesn't even matter anyway. But if I turn Vsync on, and then I have time warping no JIT, then when I do like this, there's a very noticeable kind of juddering around as I do that. So I'm going to turn that off again, and with that off, now everything is smooth again. So whatever no JIT is, I believe it's doing time warp too early. It has that effect where you get this massive judder and a kind of slipping of the image at the sides of your view. So that's not something you normally want to do. I think that's just kind of their research with time warp. Freeze Eye Update. This is a really cool thing. You turn on Freeze Eye Update, and what that does is the last image that was rendered is the image that you will see, and it will not render any more frames until you turn it back off and by pressing C. So now I can look up and down, and these frames as I look around are being generated on the fly using time warping only, so it's not rendering any new frames. And you'll notice there's a little bit of weirdness to certain, especially with close-up objects as I look up and down and as I look left and right. I'm going to talk more about that in a minute. But it's surprising just how much smooth looking around you can get even with no new frames and just using time warping. One thing I want to note, compared to the 03 SDK, this time warp is using a rectangular image that is being created based on the render target. So this kind of shows you the extent of the render target, and you can look all around from corner to corner of the whole render target. So this is the full region that's being rendered at all times inside Tuscany. This is how big it is. And when you're looking straight ahead, the edges of it get pulled in by the distortion transformation. But if you look at the corner, you can see that there's quite a bit of detail there that you're not normally able to see in your peripheral vision. By the way, if you roll your head, time warping screws up. It's not able to deal with that. And likewise, positional tracking just doesn't work with time warp. So, okay, we're back. I can look around again. Now, this is a very cool thing. Render interval seconds. So what this does is it effectively allows us to artificially reduce our frame rate to anything we want. So I'm going to, by default, it's just set to render as fast as it possibly can. I'm going to decrease this to, let's say, so if I come to a little more than 75 frames a second, that doesn't affect it at all because the display is only 75 hertz. And so it's still rendering a frame for every refresh of the display. But as I start to increase it, say I come down to 60 frames a second, it's not immediately noticeable at this point, but I am starting to get a little bit of stuttering, especially as I walk around or use positional tracking. And you can see it a little bit if you look closely at those branches in front of me, but it'll become more evident as I continue to drop the frame rate. Dropping it down to 30 frames a second. So now you can see those branches are jerking quite a bit as I use positional tracking to lean left and right. And I'm going to keep on decreasing it until I get all the way down to 10 frames a second. So you can see this blue box's motion reflecting my current frame rate. I want to get 10 frames a second. Let's do it. Let's do it. I'm going to have the worst frame rate of all demos. Almost there, almost there. 100 milliseconds, come on. And there. 10 frames a second. So you can see this is a very, very bad frame rate. I'm going to get rid of this box. But what's interesting is because of time warp, let's come up to this balcony here and look out to sea. So just look out to sea and then move your head around. You will see flashing in the edge of your vision, which is the black around the image being filled in by time warp. But the cool thing is that as you look out at the ocean and you move your head around, the image updates smoothly at 75 frames a second, even though it's only being rendered at 10 frames a second, which is pretty goddamn amazing. The idea that this is possible with this time warp technology is really, really cool. And you can roll your head as well, and it's still perfectly smooth. And this all just works. It's very, very cool. On the other hand, if you start to look at objects that are close to you, things will not go... So first of all, if you move around, the frame rate becomes apparent immediately as you start to move around. Likewise, if there were any particle effects or animations here, you would be able to tell that those were running at a reduced frame rate. And similarly here, if I'm standing in front of these branches super up close, and I start to look up and down, you'll see they're jerking around a bit as I look up and down. And that's because the time warping is not able to deal with the parallax that occurs as your head changes position with very close objects. Because when you're looking at when you're looking far away and you turn your head, because the distance from your head to the faraway object is so far, the slight positional changes of your head just don't matter. But when you're looking at something close, just turning my head means that my eyes have traveled several centimeters from left to right as I turn my head. And that's why we get this jerking around effect with time warping. Now the interesting thing is that if I hit Shift F7, or I just go in my menu, I'm going to go back here to, where is it? Zero head movement. So this is an interesting setting. What zero head movement does is it says that the positional movement of your head is reduced to zero. No matter how you turn your head, no matter how you move your body, your head will be fixed in a particular position in world space. So I'm going to turn that on. And now you can see just by turning that on, suddenly time warping is totally smooth, even on the close by objects. And the reason that works is because if your head is fixed in a particular position, when you rotate your head, that means that you're not seeing any new you're not seeing any new pixels when you turn your head. You're just rotating from a fixed position, and that's what the current time warp is good at dealing with. So it's able to handle that completely smoothly. The downside is that first of all, you've lost all positional tracking. You might as well turn your positional tracking off at this point because it's not working. And additionally, there's this more subtle effect. So even if you have positional tracking off, I'm going to turn off zero head movement, and then I'm going to turn off positional tracking. Positional tracking off. So with positional tracking off, I can't lean left and right. That doesn't work anymore. But if I turn my head with positional tracking, even with positional tracking off, if I turn my head, I still see the image update properly. And the objects, even the objects close to me, still seem to be updating, still seem to be fixed in place when I turn my head. There might be some slight movement that's incorrect, but because it's using this neck model where it's rotating around the center of my neck instead of around a fixed point, objects right in front of me seem to be fixed in place. But if I turn on zero head movement with Shift F7, now there's this weird effect where the objects right in front of me seem to move a little bit to the left or right as I turn my head left and right, and they move a little bit up and down as I move my head up and down. And the reason you see that is because it's a conflict with the brain. The brain sees how far things away are based on stereoscopy, the difference between your eyes, and it expects there to be a corresponding difference in parallax as you turn your head. When it doesn't see that, it infers that the object is actually moving, and that's not what's happening here. So just to demonstrate this, I'm actually going to turn off, I'm going to find the 0 IPD setting. Where's that 0 IPD setting? There it is. So 0 IPD, no stereoscopy. And this gets interesting. So now, with 0 head movement and no stereoscopy, there's no motion of this object in front of me when I turn my head. It moves completely smoothly because of time warping, and there is no weird motion of it when my head is moving around like there would be with zero head tracking normally, because there is no stereoscopy to conflict with the lack of parallax. So it's actually interesting that even though I'm rendering this scene at only 10 frames a second, with stereoscopy disabled and with zero head movement, I'm still able to smoothly look all around the scene and move my head any way that I like. Of course, when I move my body, it becomes very apparent that it's still only rendering at 10 frames a second. But if you have some colossally old ancient machine that can only handle a ridiculously low frame rate on a particular demo, then this could be one way that you could still enjoy the Rift as long as you can keep up, as long as time warping can keep up with the 75 frames a second requirement. Anyway, I'm going to reset all of that. So 0 IPD off. Got my stereoscopy back. 0 head movement off. Got my head movement back. And last but not least, I need my frame rate back. So again, as this starts to increase, so this leaf movement's very obvious right now, but as I start to get my frame rate up to 15 frames a second, it's a little bit less obvious now. Here it is at 20 frames a second. And when I start getting up to like 30 frames a second and higher, there's still a little bit of stuttering. Here it is at 40. There's still a little bit of stuttering as I move past it, but it's very much reduced. And because the background of the scene is being tracked smoothly, this stuttering motion of this leaf in front of me is actually not that objectionable at all. It's only when the whole scene stutters that it really bothers me, but when the background is actually being tracked fine, it's not a huge deal. And now we're back at our full frame rate. Okay, user eye height. This is just used to make you taller and shorter. I believe there's a limit in this particular application of you could come all the way down to the ground, or 0.2 meters, so you're kind of like a mouse now. Interestingly, when you're really close to the ground, some people tend to get more sick because there's more of a vector motion of the ground right beneath you, like that, and that's very close to your face. So actually increasing your height can be one way to deal with sickness. That's surprisingly counterintuitive. I am now 2.5 meters high, and the ground is moving below me at a much reduced rate. Feels weird being this tall. I feel like I'm on stilts or something. All right, I'm going to bring that back down to something more typical. Center pupil depth, I haven't figured out what this does yet. It seems to introduce a little bit of weird distortion when I increase it a lot. I would like to get a better explanation of what that one's all about. I might have to consult the source code. All right, the next option we haven't looked at yet is body relative motion. So by default in this application, if you face forward and hit W, you go forward. If you turn your head to the right and hit W, you will go to the right. If you turn your head to the left and hit W, you will go to the left. So you always, forward is always just whatever direction your head is facing, which is not quite what our real life experience is like. In real life, you can walk along and then look to the right and like look up and down while you continue to walk forward. And in order to support this, they have something called body relative motion, otherwise known as tank mode. Body relative motion lets you walk forward, look to the right while you're walking forward, look to the left, and to turn your body, you actually just have to use your mouse. So your body is turned by your mouse, and your head is free to turn completely independently of your body. And this is useful in any application where you want to like look all around while you're walking. I think it's a good option to have for players who want to be able to really like visually explore their surroundings as they're walking around. It's also really important for any application where players are navigating like really precarious, narrow planks, that kind of thing, because say that I'm in normal like head relative mode and I'm walking across a super narrow plank, and then I'm like, oh, what's that over there? And then I walk right off the plank and fall into a chasm, and that's not good. So that's a handy mode to have. It can be a little bit confusing for new players to have tank mode because they have to keep track of their body orientation as well as their head orientation. And there are two ways you can deal with that. One is you have to have a reset button. And that enables you to say, like, I'm looking forward right now. I want that to be the way my body is facing. And then you just hit R to do that. And the other way is that if you have an in-game avatar, so I don't have a body in Tuscany, my body is missing and invisible, but if I had one, I would be able to look down and say, I thought I was looking forward, but my body is like angled off to the left or to the right. Then I would hit my reset button and everything would be happy, and I would look down and see I'm facing straight ahead. So if you have both of those, that helps a lot to make tank mode more practical, and definitely consider adding it. I showed you zero head movement earlier. Vsync is, so I showed you a little bit of Vsync off earlier, but I want to really just compare Vsync on and off. I'm just going to hit my V key. So here I am looking out to sea, and Vsync is on right now. You can see 75 frames a second. And if I hit V to turn it off, so I'm currently running like 700 frames a second looking out to sea. This is a fairly low poly featureless landscape we're looking at here. But despite that, you would think that running 10 times as many frames per second, I would have like perceptible decreased latency or some kind of other visible benefit, or at least that I would be getting like vertical tears in one of my eyes that you tend to see when you're running high frame rates, higher than your screen refresh rate, but I'm not perceiving any of these. Like literally Vsync on and Vsync off appear to be completely and totally identical to me. I could not tell them apart if you asked me to. So this is going to be reassuring to people who are really worried about like, oh, well, if you force me to turn Vsync on, then I'm going to have a bad time because I need that decreased latency from having Vsync off. Well, I think with the addition of time warping, with the addition of a better motion prediction, that's not a factor anymore. I think that you have equally good latency, for at least perceptually, with both Vsync on and off. Now, keep in mind, time warp does work best on far away landscapes like the ocean there. If I'm like right up against something, like against this tree here, or something even closer, like this side of the tree. So it's hard to let me go up to the balcony. So if I walk right up to these leaves and then I turn Vsync off, I'm not sure if I can perceive it. I feel like the leaves should be moving a little bit more smoothly with Vsync off. And if I turn Vsync back on, yeah, it's so hard to tell, but I feel like there might be a little more stuttering on these super close-up objects that time warp doesn't work properly on at 75 frames a second. Anyway, let's go ahead and move on to our next thing. Multi-sampling, that's just multi-sample anti-aliasing. It's not VR specific, not a big deal. Low persistence, so low persistence, if I turn that off, everything gets a little bit brighter, and I also have a lot of motion blur while moving my head. And I think the easiest way to see this is actually if I walk up to one of these tree trunks, like this one over here. It has this texture on it that's really dominated by dark vertical lines. And if I move my head left and right while I'm looking at this tree trunk, it makes a very obvious motion blur. It's very clear. So that's a good way to perceive it if you want to check it out for yourself. Whereas if I turn low persistence on, it gets a little bit dimmer. And now there's absolutely no blur while moving my head. Like occasionally they've said like, oh, it mitigates the motion blur. I think I cannot perceive any motion blur at all while moving my head. If there is any, I can't see it. It's gone. So they did a great job with that. Dynamic prediction, I don't actually know exactly what this is. I assume it has something to do with predicting your head's position at the time of the frame render. I don't know what aspect of it is dynamic. If any of you know more about that option or have looked into the source code in detail, I would be curious to know what that option entails. Likewise, I don't know exactly what display sleep is. I suspect what display sleep is that if you're like playing this Tuscany demo and like there's a fire and you take it off and put it down, then after sitting there for a while, it would turn the display all black so that you don't get burn-in on your display. And that's important for the DK2 because the AMOLED display, if it shows a single image for a long period of time, you will get a burned-in version of that image, and that will ruin the display. So you'd have to be conscious of burn-in with the DK2. I recommend that you, in your power saving settings, set your monitor to turn off after some reasonable period of time, like an hour. Set up a screensaver, likewise, for the same reason. Consider setting your desktop to just solid black. That way that even if you leave it on the desktop, it will you'll only get burn-in like maybe in the taskbar area and not over the whole screen. So those are just a few things you can do. And it would be great if some games also supported this display sleep thing as just a built-in thing that if you're playing the game and you're inactive for a while, then it can turn it off. I think it's good to include it in the games because Windows screensavers and such can't actually detect HMD motion. So if I'm moving my head around, I'm staying in one place, I'm not touching my keyboard, not touching my mouse, Windows will think I'm inactive. And if I set my screensaver to 2 minutes, it'll just turn off the display 2 minutes later, no matter how I'm moving my head. And that's a problem with games that don't have a lot of locomotion, like say There Goes the Gottlieb or Blocked In or the Sightline the Chair. So for those, I think it's really handy to have the demo itself just pay attention to your head motion and your inputs and turn the display off if it's been too long. The next one, positional tracking. So I showed you this earlier. I turn it off and the world starts to lean with me as I move left and right. That's how it looks from my perspective. From your perspective, it looks like the display is just not changing as I lean. But since it's supposed to be changing, from my brain's perspective, I see the world kind of leaning with me. Positional tracking definitely makes the world feel it takes a second for it to come back on after I turn it on, but it makes the whole world feel a lot more solid. And like I said, you can perceive it from quite a far distance away. It's not just for like leaning over things or for like peeking through windows or for leaning around corners. It's really just, it helps to make everything feel more solid, to really like pay attention to those subtle movements of your head. And the last option, this is another mystery option, Pixel Luminance Overdrive. I've heard about this. And you can turn it on and off here, but I cannot perceive any difference with it on versus off. I feel like things get a little bit brighter with it on. There's some kind of flash when I turn it on, but the difference is very hard for me to see, and I would be very curious to know if others can give more information about what Pixel Luminance Overdrive is all about and in what situations it would be helpful. So that is all of the options in Tuscany. And I know this has been a very long video, and I just really wanted to explore everything there was to see here in Tuscany. And I think it's a great demo for anybody who wants to get into VR development, to really just play around with all these options. Like you're not going to be changing all of these options in your application typically. Usually you'll give access to some of them and the rest are just going to be fixed or they'll be provided by the SDK. But I think it helps to give you insight into the internal workings of the software and hardware. and that could be really valuable. Like say that you're messing with your application and you see this weird behavior where say you see blurring when you move your head, and you can say, oh, the low persistence must not be working, and you can say that you see the world leaning when it's not supposed to be. You can say, oh, my positional tracking must not be working. And those are just simple examples, but in general, like a lot of these things can give you insight into problematic behaviors and what the root might be. Kind of Windows abstractions that they provide you start to break down, and you need to debug things. I don't think it's the most useful demo for newbies, like I said, just because the locomotion is not very comfortable, and it's not the prettiest of demos. Like it's fairly pretty, but it's definitely got a lot of low resolution textures. There's not a whole lot going on in it, and it doesn't really have goals or anything. And so I think that there are definitely other demos that are worth checking out first. But I think everybody should really check out Tuscany at some point and really play with the options, because that can help you to get insight into the platform that goes beyond just and enjoying of VR experiences, and can help you to develop your understanding of VR, and hopefully one day help to build VR content. So that's all for today. Let me know if you have any thoughts about Tuscany. Let me know if you've tried anything that I haven't, if you can explain any of those options that were mysterious to me. Let me just let me know what other demos you want to see me play. A lot of people have requested Elite Dangerous. That is definitely on my list. I have not forgotten. I was waiting for the 0.4.0 SDK version of Elite Dangerous, but I might not wait for that. We'll see how it goes. I will see you guys next time, and everybody have a great every day.